This is Dr. Carroll, and this video is about file I/O. Continuing in this series, let's talk about file output. Now, output, to explain and to write, is conceptually simpler than, say, input. So start here. Or if you've already seen input, then this will be refreshing to get a simpler view. So I will describe the typical usage and not all the options for file output. There's a lot, as you can imagine. So I first want to talk about the file writer class, the buffered writer class, and the PrintWriter class. So the file writer class, importantly, can take a constructor which can take a file name. Let's look at the documentation for this. So here we have class file writer. Here's its inheritance hierarchy. And notice its constructors. It can take a file object, which I mentioned briefly before in another video. But what I'm going to illustrate here is taking a string that has a file name. While we're here, let's check out the methods. Oh, wow, look at that. It doesn't have any methods in and of itself. It inherits write and close from other objects, from other classes. And so I think that's very interesting. And so let's go to this constructor now. Notice, so it takes a file name, but notice it throws an IO exception, meaning it may throw an exception. So we need to be aware of that when we're programming it to be able to handle this checked exception. Okay. Now let's talk about the buffered writer class. So it has a constructor which can take a file writer object. Look at that. Okay, so let's go to that documentation. Here we have buffered writer. It inherits from java.io.writer, implements several interfaces. So its constructor here is it's going to take a writer, is really, notice it's just writer, and then there's a size. And it doesn't have a lot of fancy methods here. Notice that it just has write, or write one character, or write a portion of a string. And so not a lot of options here with buffered writer. Now the reason to include buffered writer is that I/O speeds are very slow. And what do we mean by very slow? We mean in compared to CPU speeds. You can do approximately 20 million instructions on the CPU, like math or multiplication, in the time it takes you to get the first byte from a disk in just a standard system. 20 million instructions in the time it takes you to do that. So I/O is very slow. And so what buffering does is it significantly improves the performance by reading or writing in large chunks. So let me give you an analogy. There's the closest Brazilian store that I can find to where I live right now is about an hour and 45 minutes, depending on the traffic in Atlanta. So you can imagine I don't get there very often, but when I do you think I buy one thing, or do I buy multiple months worth? You're right, I buy multiple months worth of products so I don't have to travel up there. Well, it's so slow to get all the way up there and back that I'm gonna get a whole buffer full. I'm gonna take care of a whole load of work all at the same time so that I don't have to turn right back around and do it again the next time I want to go up there. And so that's the same sort of thing with buffering. It's, let's spend our time doing other things, and we'll do that, but let's be strategic about doing it. So that's the thought behind buffering. It improves execution performance by bundling things together and doing them together, allowing the CPU to do other things instead of spending all of its time worrying about I/O. So that's a very good thing. The last class I want to talk about is the PrintWriter class. Now, importantly, the constructor could take a buffered writer object. Look at that. or it can take a file writer object as well, but hopefully I've sold you on buffered writing. Okay, and so let's look at the documentation here for PrintWriter. Okay, so its constructor, we can take a field or a stream or a writer, okay, or we can even just give it a file name, but that's not going to allow us to have the buffered writing. Okay, and so there are several options there of which we have, but importantly, let's look at the methods. Okay, so we can append a character. That's not really special, but notice we have all the prints just like we had with our print stream. We have a whole set of prints here. We've got our printfs and we've got print lines. Oh, that's nice, because now that we are already accustomed to our prints with system.out, then we can just reuse that same sort of syntax here. Also, we can write a character or a string using the write method. Okay, well that was great, but let's see some examples now to solidify this. I've got two examples, file writer example and math practice. Let's start with file writer example, and as you can guess, what this example is about using a file writer object. Remember, this is the first one I detailed in the documentation. So here we have a Java doc, we import a whole bunch of things. We have a close writer method. We'll come back to that. Scrolling up, here's our main. We're going to open up the standard input stream, so get input probably from the keyboard, as I've shown in other videos. We're going to store what we get from the user in user input. We're also going to get a file name, and then we're going to create a file writer object out, and we need to assign it to null, otherwise it'll say it might not have been initialized, and I'm just calling it out here. So this is an object. So we prompt the user here, please enter a joke, and then we get the entire line, which will read up to a new line, but not save the new line, and that's because a joke is often more than one word, so we need to get a whole line. So then we say, okay, well, where do you want to store this? We're assuming file names are only, don't have spaces in them, so we'll just use next. And then notice we are trying, in a try block, we're gonna create a new file writer given this file name. And the reason is as pointed out just a minute ago, it can throw an IO exception, and that's a checked in exception, so we need to be ready to catch it in case something goes wrong. What if the user specifies a file name that doesn't exist, for example? Okay, so once it's opened successfully, then we're going to go through for each character in this user input. We're going to pull that character out, and we're going to write that character with write here, write it out one character at a time, and then once we're all done, we're going to append a new line, because remember when we used next line here, it did not have the new line at the end. We're going to put that there, and then if we successfully get here, we don't execute the catch, we do execute the finally statement, and we pass out to close writer up to this method, and this tries to close a writer object. In this case, a file writer will work. And so we need to make sure the file wasn't null. We could be in finally because it never opened the file writer object, at which case this file would be null. And so if it's not null, because we'll get a null pointer exception if we don't test for this and it is null, we now call close on it. Now close itself can throw an IO exception, which is why we pulled it out into a method so that we didn't have a try-catch block in a finally block for simplicity and for code reuse. And so we'll catch this IO exception if it throws it and say, hey, something went wrong when trying to close it. And if it went wrong, we can just report that it went wrong, but there's nothing more we can do. We don't need to close the file because we can't close the file. So there we go. All right, let's compile it and see it. Java file writer example.java. Woohoo! It compiles. Okay, please enter a joke. Got a joke? Okay, I got one. There's only types of people. We'll just let you complete that. Okay, where do we want to save our joke? Let's save it in joke.txt. All right, and remember we had that print statement out. There's only, and I put a period at the end, only 10 type of people in the world, ... And then notice there's no new line, because I just didn't put that in the loop. Sorry, there is a new line, but we're not displaying that. So the reference is valid, so we're attempting to close the file. So now if we just cat that file, cat the joke, there's only 10 types of people in the world. It wrote every one of those. Okay, great. Let's go on to the other example. If you survived elementary school, then you had to do some multiplication problems. And so this is going to generate random multiplication problems intended for you for practice, or maybe your niece or nephew, your child, or maybe you just want to brush up. So here we're saying, hey, we're just going to do 20 problems. Here's main. We're going to request output file name from the user, try to open the file, and then for each one of the problems, we'll just randomly generate 2 numbers, write them to a file, close the file. This is really just some vehicle for doing file output. Again, open up the input file stream, get the user file name, and then we need to create a random object, a random number generator object. And then notice what we're doing here. Here, we're using PrintWriter instead of FileWriter. And let's see if that works a little better. Scrolling up. So here's our try block. What we're going to do, okay, we're going to prompt the user. We're going to ask the user for input. That could fail. But notice we have our FileWriter object here with the file name, so that needs to be in the try. And then notice we create it, pass it to BufferedWriter, create our BufferedWriter object, and pass it to PrintWriter. And so we catch our exceptions here, and if we have an input mismatch from getting the file name, there's nothing really we can do, so we'll just return. I mean, I guess we could ask for it again, but we're just being simple here. So this is from the scanner.next file not found exception. Hey, that's not a valid file name. We could have asked the user for a valid file name, but for simplicity we are not. And then this is everything else is what this is. And so now for our 20 problems, and notice we have a compound continuation criterion here. So if we haven't finished our 20 problems and we have not found an error, then keep going. Well, let's keep in mind, where's that found error? So generate 2 random numbers between 0 and 10, and with using the random number generator. And then notice here on our PrintWriter, we just have a simple print line like we're so familiar with. So we take num1 multiplied by num2 equals, and we leave it there for someone to practice. Now notice with PrintWriter, what we have to do here, instead of it throwing an exception, it just sets an error flag. You may like that more or less. So we need to say, hey, was there a problem when I tried to use it? And so if there was a problem, we need to remember that and then not keep going with it. So hence found the error, which will stop our loop here. and then once we're out, then we try and close it again. Or this close won't throw an exception, so we can just call close there. Okay, so let's see this. Math practice. Yay, it compiles. Love it when that happens. Okay, enter a file name. Let's see, we need math.txt, we'll say. Okay, so if we look at math.txt, okay, 0 times 1. Ooh, I know that one. 7 times 3. There's our math prompts. Notice if we run it again and we give it the same file name, it's just going to write over that file. It does not care what the contents of that file is. Now let's run it again, and let's say we give it the directory does not exist.txt. Oh, sorry, that was not a valid file name. No such file or directory. Oh, and I forgot, for completeness, let's just do it again for our joke. Run that here, boo, and then we can say the same thing. We know this does not exist, and so notice it says IO exception does not exist, file not found, or the directory. One more thing to mention about the math practice. Notice we had the file writer, buffer writer, print writer, bam, bam, bam. You'll often see it written just as one line, because all we're doing is we're creating a file writer, we're immediately passing it to a buffer writer here. So this will create a file writer object, return it, but all it is, its sole purpose is to feed into the constructor for buffered writer, whose sole purpose is to feed into a PrintWriter constructor as well. So you'll often see that as well. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out my input video as well.